I'm really pleased to be invited back by The Economist to this forum in Greece. I wrote an article a year ago in Foreign Affairs about what countries did well and what countries did poorly dealing with the pandemic. And if I wrote it today, I would have to come up with completely different conclusions, which has taught me to be very cautious in making predictions, especially, as Yogi Berra once said, predictions about the future. So I'm going to flip a little bit between pessimistic and optimistic scenarios. So if you take a big view of the world and of global politics, we have been in a democratic recession for the last 15 years. The organization Freedom House in New York rates global democracy every year, and there's been 15 years of decline, and 2020 was one of the sharpest declines. And in fact, two very big, important democracies, India and the United States, actually became only partial democracies as a result of things that had happened. And international cooperation, which is the subject of this panel, has been affected by that because some of the biggest challenges from authoritarian and populist opponents of democracy don't want to cooperate. They want to compete. And so there's been a lot of competition. You would think that a global crisis, a global health crisis, would create new institutions for future cooperation, but in fact, the vaccine and the response became weaponized, and so it became an element of competition between Russia, China, and the West as to who could respond better. And then obviously domestically, there were a lot of governments around the world, in Hungary and El Salvador and Uganda, Philippines, many other places that used the crisis as an excuse to expand executive powers. Hungarian parliament, one of the first things they did when the crisis hit was to grant Viktor Orban emergency powers, and of course the first thing he used it for was to clamp down on the LGBTQ movement. So, you know, that's some of the negative developments. On the other hand, there's been this very interesting phenomenon that there are a number of populists around the world who really failed. They failed miserably in responding to the pandemic, and in a way they've condemned themselves to, you know, a kind of political limbo as a result of that. I would put Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil in that category, Andrés López Obrador in Mexico, Prime Minister Modi in India. All of these politicians were leading populist movements. Mr. Janša, who's now your EU president, you know, was fall in that category. They screwed up their response, and I think the reason that they didn't become more overtly authoritarian was that, you know, as populists, they don't want to do things that are unpopular. They don't want to force people to wear masks or to social distance, and as a result, all of their countries faced a big health crisis. And of course, the one populist politician that suffered the most from this was Donald Trump. Donald Trump, before the pandemic hit, I think would have, you know, was on track to be reelected for a second term, which would have been an absolute disaster for the United States and for the world. But because of his mishandling of COVID, he lost the election. All right, and that has then transformed global politics because U.S.-European relations have been put back on a you know, much more traditional footing by President Biden. I think that everybody in Europe breathed this big sigh of relief after the G7 and the NATO summits that were held last month. He said all the right things about restoring democracy as the central core of shared values, you know, between the U.S. And Europe. But again, to turn a little bit pessimistic, I would say that there are several outstanding flies in that ointment. The first is that, you know, the superficial agreement at those summits, I do think masks some really deep disagreements on strategy. I think there are too many Europeans who continue to believe that Europe can somehow float as an independent power between the United States and China and Russia and maintain an independent policy that balances between all of these different forces. I think that's a total illusion. I think that in terms of basic values, China and Russia really have nothing in common with the values that have created and underlaying the European Union. And although I very much appreciate and support the desire of Europeans to be strategically more self-sufficient, every American has been hectoring Europe to spend more on its own defense for decades now. I think that's a very good thing. The idea that somehow politically you can maneuver between these big blocs, I think, is an illusion, because the values that are represented by a country like China, which has turned, I think, from an authoritarian country, a kind of ordinary authoritarian country, in a totalitarian direction, is really the biggest challenge that global politics faces. The final issue really is about the United States, and I think that no American ally is under any illusion that the alliance is out of the woods because of Joe Biden's election. 1/3 of Americans believe that that election was stolen by Joe Biden, that President Trump was reelected, there was massive fraud, and that we are now ruled by an illegitimate, Democrat. And I think if you don't live in the United States, you may not appreciate how crazy American politics has gotten. I mean, something like 1/3 of Republicans believe the QAnon conspiracy theory that the Democrats are actually pedophiles that meet in secret tunnels under Washington, D.C. to eat children.
Are you saying that's not the case?
Well, I've not seen credible evidence that this is really what's driving the Democrats. And it's really reached a point where you have to explain these things not politically in terms of kind of political interest, but psychologically, because I think, and this leads me to my final pessimistic point, which is about technology. I don't think that this could have happened, let's say, 30 years ago, when we had 3 major television networks in the United States, all basically supporting a basic consensus about what the truth was about, let's say, a big epidemic. You couldn't have had a president that would have gotten up and said the election was stolen with 0 evidence. But with the rise of the internet and with the rise of social media, we are living in this extremely chaotic universe where we do not have a common factual basis on which we can deliberate as a democratic community. This has hit the United States, I think, much worse than it's hit Europe, but I'm afraid that it is a condition that will feed, continuing polarization and populism in many other societies. And so I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but I actually do not see a solution for this particular problem right now on the horizon.